This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for the 500th episode of MTG Top 10. I don't normally release Top 10s on Wednesdays, but because my review for Dominaria United is coming this Friday, I didn't want this video to get buried, so you get it 2 days early. This is a big milestone, and actually pretty crazy for me to say that I've made 500 of these at this point. I also recently crossed over 75,000 subscribers, and all of that is thanks to all of you watching these videos. Otherwise, none of this would have ever happened. As part of the 500th episode celebration, I now have a logo for this series. I figure if I'm going to do 500 episodes of something, it should probably have its own logo. You can buy a shirt featuring the new logo over on Merchland, and you can find a link in the description. So, in celebration of this big milestone, I'm bringing you an extra long episode of MTG Top 10 today. I've been asked many times what I think is the most important set in Magic history, and today I'm finally going to answer, giving you my picks for the 10 most important sets we've ever seen. Most videos in this series measure things based on competitive Magic, but this list is a little bit different. I'm not measuring these sets based solely on how good the cards in them are. Instead, I'm taking a look at things that the sets first introduced and the kind of impact those innovations have had on the game. In other words, these are the 10 sets that really changed the game. Literally. This list is, of course, based on my own opinion and not on data or metrics, and we all have different ideas about what makes a Magic set important, but my opinions are, of course, going to be supported by a whole lot of facts. Alright, let's jump into the list. At number 10, I have Modern Horizons. Released in 2019, this is the newest set on the list, and by a significant margin. This set didn't introduce any major innovations in terms of card types or mechanics, but it did something no other Magic set had ever done. The cards in it were legal in Modern, but they weren't legal in formats with newer cards like Standard or Pioneer. It wasn't unusual for a special set release to be legal in Legacy or Vintage. Any cards that are printed at all tend to be legal in those formats. But a set that skips Standard and is legal in Modern? That really changed the game. For the first time, R&D could make cards for the explicit purpose of being used in Modern without having to worry about what they might do to Standard. Whether you love or hate the fact that they decided to do this, there is no doubt that it had a huge impact on the game and on the very format that it was meant to impact, Modern. Of course, there were a whole lot of cards in the set that were too good, with Hogak Arisen Necropolis the best example. It also set a precedent for some potential future releases that are only intended for specific, non-standard formats, and this is something we're already seeing in digital Magic with the various anthologies and sets like Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate, where the cards are legal in Historic and Alchemy, but not in Standard or Explorer. We have also, of course, received Modern Horizons 2, and I think it's safe to say we'll be seeing more sets like this in the future, perhaps for Pioneer. Whether you think this is a good or a bad thing, it has certainly had a significant impact and altered the trajectory of Magic. At number 9, I have Commander, the set which came out in 2011 and is often known these days as Commander 2011. This was the first time that Wizards of the Coast formally recognized and supported the Elder Dragon Highlander format, which they renamed Commander because of obvious legal issues with the whole Highlander part of the name. EDH had existed since at least the mid-1990s at this point, so Wizards of the Coast didn't create Commander. That's why this isn't even higher up on the list. But the fact that they decided to acknowledge the format's existence for the first time is a big deal. They printed pre-constructed decks that were explicitly tailored for the format, and they included some new cards. And all of that has ended up being a pretty major shift for Magic. It's no secret that today, Commander is the game's most popular format, and ever since these 2011 precons, there are annual Commander pre-constructed decks with new cards designed for the format, and even outside of Commander sets, the design team generally thinks about Commander whenever they're designing cards, since it is the most popular format. The number of legendary creatures that are printed has increased exponentially as a result, especially at lower rarities. More legendary creatures have been printed since 2018 than had been printed in the entire history of Magic before that. It is also a pretty safe bet that Commander would not have become the most popular format if it weren't for Wizards of the Coast formally supporting and catering to the format. The format was fairly popular even before 2011, but it was nowhere near as popular as it is now. The release of the first Commander set really marked a shift in Magic design and really brought about a change in the game's player base. At number 8, I have Miradin. This one sort of applies to all the sets in Miradin block, and there are two big contributions here. One of them is that it started a major shift in the way sets were envisioned and designed. Before Miradin, we usually just stuck around on Dominaria, sometimes catching glimpses of other planes. There were some exceptions to this. Homelands was on Ulgratha, Tempest block was on Wrath, Masks block was on Mercadia, and Arabian Nights was retroactively given its own plane, but the shift in different planes didn't become a central part of set design until Miradin block, which was set on an entirely new, artifact-centric plane. Ever since then, we hop between different planes from set to set, and they're usually planes we've never even heard of or know very little about. This allows Wizards of the Coast to create a wider variety of sets, since they can also move to different planes with regularity. This keeps things from getting stale, while also allowing for more innovation in terms of story and cards. Before Miradin, sets had only been released on 4 non-Dominaria planes, and that's only if we count the dubious Arabian Nights. The few years after Miradin, we took trips to Kamigawa, Ravnica, Lorwyn, Shadowmoor, Alara, and Zendikar. Each of these planes has a distinct identity instead of just being sort of a generic fantasy plane, as virtually all of them were before Miradin block. And we haven't really stopped hopping from plane to plane ever since. Mechanically, the set was also fairly important because it introduced the equipment subtype, which has gone on to become an evergreen mechanic. Equipment are played in all of Magic's formats, and they appear in every single set, and this is where it all began. Of course, they did famously make some mistakes with equipment in the block, as they often do when they create a brand new mechanic, and Skullclamp and Darksteel was completely absurd, but equipment is a pretty big part of Magic these days, and it wouldn't be here without Miradin. It is worth noting that Miradin had a ton of problems in terms of power level, making artifact decks especially busted, and that certainly led to an impact on the game too, although not a great one. Miradin block resulted in something of a downturn in the player base because the set was so much of a disaster in terms of balance. At number 7, I have Ravnica, and this is another one where it sort of applies to the entire block. It was the first set to have really well-developed, detailed factions, both mechanically and in the lore. Factions had shown up to some extent in older sets, but they were usually fairly ill-defined. Not so with Ravnica, where each guild had their own color combination and their own unique mechanic. These well-defined guilds were also important because they made the limited format very cohesive. It was the first set to really have well-developed two-color archetypes that were well-supported. For example, the Selesnya had the Convoke mechanic, so they liked going wide with Saprolings, the Golgari brought Dredge along and they were a graveyard deck, and so on. These well-defined archetypes are what we expect out of pretty much every set, and the first time we saw something like that was Ravnica. Ravnica was such a success with its factions that we regularly have other sets that have factions that occupy certain colors. In addition to all of our visits to Ravnica, we've also seen similar factional designs in blocks and sets like Alara, Khans of Tarkir, Streets of New Capenna, and Strixhaven. On top of all of that, this set really brought multicolored in Magic to the forefront. It was not the first ever set to have a multicolored theme. That would be Legends, and Invasion block was also designed as a multicolored block, but neither of those sets went as hard on it. The success of Ravnica meant that Wizards of the Coast was more willing to put multicolored stuff in every single set. Before Ravnica, many sets had 0 multicolored cards. They didn't like printing multicolored cards in core sets, for example, and most sets only had a handful. These days, we expect multicolored cards in every single set, and that was something that really came about as a result of the success of Ravnica. In his State of Design article in 2011, Mark Rosewater divided Magic's history into several stages of design, and he wrote that Ravnica began the 4th stage of design, so it truly represented a very real change. In particular, they really planned everything out about the entire block before they began designing everything, instead of just taking things one set at a time as they had before. This is a big part of what made Ravnica so cohesive. The original Ravnica block is one of the most loved by many Magic players, so it's no surprise that Wizards has tried to adapt things that work in Ravnica to Magic as a whole, in addition to the fact that they take us back to the plane of Ravnica itself all the time. At number 6, I have Lorwyn. For a while, I had this lower on the list, but in the end, I decided the fact that the set introduced Planeswalkers meant it should be higher on the list. Planeswalkers have not only become one of the game's core card types, the introduction of Planeswalker cards really shifted things in terms of the story. There had always been planeswalkers in the lore, but most of them never received real cards that represented them. By introducing planeswalker cards, it made marketing new sets and their characters a lot easier. It also made stories easier to follow for those of us that don't really follow the lore much outside of looking at actual cards. The 5 that were introduced in this set, Ajani, Jace, Liliana, Chandra, and Garruk, have all gone on to be pretty central to Magic's story too, and have received many more cards over the years. Planeswalkers are also, of course, incredibly powerful, and they play some role in all of Magic's formats, and in many of them, that role is quite prominent. Like a lot of things on this list, whether you think the introduction of Planeswalkers was a good thing or a bad thing, you can't argue that they haven't really transformed Magic. Lorwyn did actually also introduce a second card type, the Tribal type. It originally made its debut on a single card in Time Spiral, but became an Evergreen card type in Lorwyn. Of course, it being Evergreen didn't last long, it ultimately wasn't that well received, and it has since been retired. Lorwyn's other major contribution was the so-called Grand Creature Type update. With Lorwyn, which was a tribal-focused block, creature types were really reinvented, and it was decided that most creatures should have a race-class model for their creature types. So, instead of just being a Kithkin, a card like Burrenton Forge Tender is a Kithkin Wizard. And instead of just being an elf, Imperious Perfect is an elf warrior, and makes elf warrior tokens too. This became the standard, and as part of the release of Lorwyn, they went back through the game's expansive catalog and changed creature types all over the place to match this new model. This race class model has also continued to today, largely unchanged since Lorwyn, and is what we're used to seeing today for creature types. At number 5, I have 6th edition, which is also known as Classic 6th edition. Old core sets generally didn't introduce big things that changed the game. Some people kind of consider Alpha to be a core set, but it isn't really one since it was just the set that debuted this game. But anyway, old core sets consisted entirely of reprints and were intentionally simple, so it would be easy for new players, but 6th edition was nonetheless a big deal, largely because it introduced sweeping rules changes. While some later core sets would also introduce some other big shifts in the rules, like 10th edition, which brought an end to damage on the stack and mana burn, the rule changes in 6th edition were even more transformative, and that's why 10th edition didn't make this list, but 6th edition did. So let's cover all of these rule changes from 6th edition. The biggest of these, by far, was the introduction of the stack, something that remains a crucial part of the game since it determines the order in which spells resolve. This is a system we still use today. Previously, the game used a batch system. For batches, everything was first in, last out, just like it is on the stack, but there was one big difference. Damage from spells didn't happen until the entire batch had resolved. This meant something as simple as casting Shock in response to your opponent casting Giant Growth on their creature didn't work how it does today, because the damage wouldn't happen until after Giant Growth had resolved, so now the creature is too big to die to Shock, even if you cast Shock in response. That is a vastly different way of doing things. On a related note, 6th edition removed the Interrupt and Mana Source types from cards. Before the stack, Interrupts and Mana Sources worked differently than other spells, as they would both resolve before the rest of a batch did. With no batches, Instants, Interrupts, and Mana Sources all worked the same way. So they were no longer needed. Another rule change. Now, if you went to 0 life, you lost immediately. Before this, you didn't actually lose the game until a phase ended when you had 0 life, and this could enable some pretty crazy combo shenanigans, especially with something like Necropotence. The rules around tapped permanents also changed fairly drastically. Previously, a tapped creature who was blocking dealt no damage, and a tapped artifact had its effect ignored as long as it was tapped. Both of those things were no longer true. Tapping now had no real impact on a card's effect. Summon spells were also removed. Previously, what we call today a creature spell was called a summon spell, with creatures having the word summon and their creature type on the type line. 6th edition changed the creature type line into what we're used to seeing today. They now said creature and had a hyphen and then a creature type. This would open up the door for creatures to have multiple types, something that is part and parcel of the game these days. While it isn't a huge deal, it's also worth noting that 6th edition keyworded haste for the first time. So, yeah, 6th edition had a massive impact on Magic, and most of its changes are still relevant in the game today. At number 4, I have Chronicles. So, like 6th edition, this is another set that was all reprints, so it isn't really the content of the set that changed the game. It was released in 1995, and it was the first time they had ever released any kind of reprint set. But what really makes it notable was the player reaction to it. By 1995, people were already seeing Magic as an investment, and cards were rapidly gaining value. Between 4th edition earlier in the year and Chronicles, players began to become very concerned about the potential for excessive reprints, causing copies of rares and sought-after cards to become easier to obtain. This would mean that the value of original printings of cards would go down. People's objections to Chronicles were loud enough that Wizards of the Coast had to respond, and respond they did by creating the Reserved List. This was a promise from Wizards that they wouldn't reprint any cards that had appeared in Alpha or Beta, or any uncommons or rares from Arabian Nights or Antiquities, or rares from Legends. After that, rares from new sets were added to the Reserved List, and this was discontinued from Mercadian Masks forward. The reserved list remains in force today. While Wizards of the Coast has found some ways around the list at times, like printing premium versions of cards and the like, for the most part it has continued to be a big part of Magic. After all, it's a list of cards that they say will never be reprinted, and that's why so many cards from the early days of Magic are expensive, even some that aren't particularly good. The reaction to Chronicles drastically altered Wizards' game plan when it came to reprinting cards, and we're still feeling the ramifications of it today. Whether you love or hate the reserved list, you can't really argue that it hasn't played a major role in shaping the game. At number 3, I have Mirage, and this is another one that refers more generally to the block as a whole, and that's part of what was so important about Mirage. It was the first set truly designed in the block model. While the earlier Ice Age, Homelands, and Alliances were technically the first block, that was sort of a prototype of what would become a more successful implementation of the idea in Mirage block. Ice Age block featured a disjointed story and fairly weak mechanical themes, and this was especially true of the middle set, Homelands, which was set on a completely different unconnected plane and also happened to be a really bad set overall. In one of his State of Design articles, Mark Rosewater notes that Mirage began the second stage of Magic design because, for the first time, sets were thought about collectively. Before Mirage, design was focused more on individual cards and less on entire sets, and certainly not on an entire year's worth of releases that make up a block. So, Mirage was the first time there was a successful implementation of this block-style release schedule, and this was largely because, from the beginning, it was designed with the intention of being a block where the cards would all go together. This kind of design made the 3 sets in this block, Mirage, Visions, and Weatherlight, very much interconnected in terms of their story and their mechanics. Mirage set the precedent of a block consisting of one big set and 2 smaller sets, too. This block design allowed for a fairly cohesive block constructed format. This was a format where you could only play cards from the 3 sets in this block, and it was a format that managed to stick around all the way until 2014. The set was also designed with block limited in mind. In Block Limited, you would do a draft where you had one pack from each set in the block. This brings me to the next big thing that was new for Mirage. It was the first set designed with limited in mind. Previously, limited formats were just a bunch of random cards thrown together, and this was pretty miserable. This is because cards were designed individually, as I said earlier, and not thought of as a collective at all. So, earlier sets weren't careful to make sure that there were things like 2 and 3 drop creatures in a particular color for it to be viable and limited. And I don't mean good 2 drop and 3 drop creatures, I mean any of them at all. When you aren't designing with limited in mind, that kind of thing doesn't really matter. But with Mirage block, they designed everything with a healthy limited and block format in mind, and this is still how they design sets today, even in the absence of actual blocks. Obviously, I'm quite thankful for this because limited is my favorite way to play Magic, and if they hadn't made this change, that probably wouldn't be true. This block also began Magic's first long-term story in the Weatherlight Saga, which was Magic's main story for the next several years. As important as the block model is, it has not survived until today. They were officially retired in 2017, but this still means that Mirage introduced something that was around for about 2 decades of Magic history. Another important thing introduced in Mirage block, although less important than we've talked about so far, was the introduction of Enter the Battlefield abilities for creatures, which came in Visions, something that has gone on to be a staple in the game today. So yeah, Mirage's impact on the game is pretty hard to overstate. At number 2, I have Legends. I think this one being up this high might surprise some people, though you may have heard me talk about how important this set is before, like in the top 10 on the set I did a few weeks back, or in the Card Kingdom article I wrote about the set. But Legends is incredibly important, and I think, obviously, the second most important set in Magic history. We've seen a lot of sets on this list that did one really big thing. Well, Legends did two massive things by introducing two things that have simply become part of the very fabric of Magic: multicolored cards and legendary permanents. And yeah, most of the multicolored and legendary permanents are absolutely awful in Legends, and that's part of why the set is often overlooked. But the fact is that those are things we see in every single set released these days, usually a whole bunch of them. EDH wouldn't exist without legendary creatures, and that's the main way people play Magic these days. Magic would also be a much less interesting place if we only had monocolored cards. And sure, the idea of multicolored cards was probably inevitable from the day the game was created, but the fact is that Legends is where they did it first. The introduction of legendary creatures was also important for the game's lore. You could now make creatures who represent unique individuals, which also, in turn, meant that you could write stories about them. For example, this was the set in which Nicol Bolas was first introduced, a figure who became a key villain throughout the game's story. And at number 1, it is, predictably enough, Alpha. There really couldn't be anything else at number 1. This was Magic's first set, so it obviously outshines every other set that has come since. It originated the very idea of the TCG itself. It is easy for us to forget, because the game has been around for 30 years at this point, and there are dozens upon dozens of other CCGs and TCGs, but Richard Garfield truly created something revolutionary when he created Magic the Gathering. The idea that you could collect cool cards and then actually play them in a game was just not something anyone else had come up with. Obviously, this set introduced the game itself and most of the game's card types. There really isn't a lot more to say about it because Alpha's contribution to Magic and gaming history on the whole is so broad. Of course, it has a bunch of the game's most iconic cards, from the Power 9 to Shivan Dragon, but the very invention of the TCG is what really allows Alpha to be the most important Magic set ever, and that will never change. So, those are my picks for the 10 most important sets in the history of Magic. Do you think I left any important sets out? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this 500th edition of MTG Top 10. I plan on making 500 more. If you want to make sure you catch the next 500 MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the first 500, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. If you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and my work on the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron or a YouTube member, or by buying Nitsahone merch, including the brand new MTG Top 10 shirt. Thanks for watching.